and we are the friends of almost 1 billion worldwide who practice the Islamic faith. The United States of America is an enemy of those who aid terrorists and of the barbaric criminals who profane a great religion by committing murder in its name. This military action is a part of our campaign against terrorism, another front in a war that has already been joined through diplomacy, intelligence, the freezing of financial assets, and the arrests of known terrorists by law enforcement agents in 38 countries. Given the nature and reach of our enemies, we will win this conflict by the patient accumulation of successes, by meeting a series of challenges with determination and will and purpose. Today we focus on Afghanistan, but the battle is broader. Every nation has a choice to make. In this conflict, there is no neutral ground. If any government sponsors the outlaws and killers of innocents, they have become outlaws and murderers themselves, and they will take that lonely path at their own peril. I'm speaking to you today from the treaty room of the White House, a place where American presidents have worked for peace. We're a peaceful nation. Yet as we have learned so suddenly and so tragically, there can be no peace in a world of sudden terror. In the face of today's new threat, the only way to pursue peace is to pursue those who threaten it. We did not ask for this mission, but we will fulfill it. The name of today's military operation is Enduring Freedom. We defend not only our precious freedoms, but also the freedom of people everywhere to live and raise their children free from fear. I know many Americans feel fear today, and our government is taking strong precautions. All law enforcement and intelligence agencies are working aggressively around America, around the world, and around the clock. At my request, many governors have activated the National Guard to strengthen airport security. We have called up reserves to reinforce our military capability and strengthen the protection of our homeland. In the months ahead, our patience will be one of our strengths. Patience with the long waits that will result from tighter security. Patience in understanding that it will take time to achieve our goals. Patience in all the sacrifices that may come. Today, those sacrifices are being made by members of our armed forces who now defend us so far from home, and by their proud and worried families. A commander-in-chief sends America's sons and daughters into a battle in a foreign land only after the greatest care and a lot of prayer. We ask a lot of those who wear our uniform. We ask them to leave their loved ones, to travel great distances, to risk injury, even to be prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice of their lives. They are dedicated. They are honorable. They represent the best of our country, and we are grateful. To all the men and women in our military, every sailor, every soldier, every airman, every Coast Guardsman, every Marine, I say this: your mission is defined, your objectives are clear, your goal is just. You have my full confidence, and you will have every tool you need to carry out your duty. I recently received a touching letter that says a lot about the state of America in these difficult times. A letter from a 4th grade girl with a father in the military. As much as I don't want my dad to fight, she wrote, I'm willing to give him to you. This is a precious gift, the greatest she could give. This young girl knows what America is all about. Since September 11, an entire generation of young Americans has gained new understanding of the value of freedom and its cost in duty and in sacrifice. The battle is now joined on many fronts. We will not waver. We will not tire. We will not falter. And we will not fail. Peace and freedom will prevail. Thank you. May God continue to bless America.
And that was President George W. Bush speaking from the treaty room of the White House, where he formally announced the American assault on Afghanistan. In fact, crucially, he spoke of British forces having taken part in that attack. He repeated America's demands, essentially the handover and the end of the Al-Qaeda network. That's Osama bin Laden's network. Let's join now our correspondent Philippa Thomas to get some more on this. Philippa, what did you make of that statement?
I thought what George Bush was saying there was that these are carefully targeted operations. The key points he was trying to make there were, first, the warning, the war has started. Now the Taliban will pay a price for failing to comply with US demands. But very soon after, and very carefully, he said, we are the friends of the people of Afghanistan. And indeed went on to say that while part of the point of the activities taking place over Kabul was to knock out military installations. The US and British forces are aiming at terrorist training camps. They will also be using their planes to drop food aid in the coming days and weeks, to drop food and supplies and medicine to the people of Afghanistan, trying to make it very clear they're wanting the message to get through to the people on the ground that this is very targeted.
Philippa, he spoke there of sustained action, so it's clear that we're not talking about 1 or 2 days.
That's right. First, he wanted to get over this point that this was that his targets were limited, that this was not a war against Afghanistan, but also he wanted to make the point that this was a long campaign. And you know, one of the interesting phrases that's being used in Washington at the moment, I was reading it in the Post this morning, was that we should be preparing ourselves not for World War III, but for Cold War II. That's the phrase that's being used to talk about the fact that it is about military action. That's what we're seeing now. It's also very much about intelligence. It's about economic action. It's about the diplomatic coalition. This is one front, the most tangible, the most dramatic front of the US-led war against terrorism or against certain terrorist groups, but very much a warning coming even from that short address from the President today to say that's not all, to say this will be a relentless campaign. We ask for your patience, though. It's all about, as the President put it, the patient accumulation of successes, which is quite a careful way of putting it. Don't expect quick results.
Philippa, a wider military coalition, do you think, than we at first suspected? He spoke about Canada, Germany and France taking part eventually.
That's right, and that does help to explain to us, doesn't it, why this action has taken place so many weeks after the attacks of September 11th. There have been so many flurries when there were rumours that action was imminent a week ago, 2 weeks ago, that strikes would happen very quickly, as had happened in the past, for example, against Iraq, under President Clinton, against Osama bin Laden after the bombing of the embassies in East Africa. But this time, it's been very clear that what the White House and the Pentagon have been concerned about is trying to get all the allies on board. There have been these shuttle meetings, officials going back and forth to NATO, the lines hot between Downing Street and the White House, trying to get everything in place, trying to work out who can play what roles in a military and diplomatic sense before the initial action was taken.
And when the President talks about the Taliban paying the price, it's clear that, do you think, has become a war aim now?
Well, I found that very interesting because up to now, in fact, the White House has been careful and much more careful than Downing Street in talking about the aim being to get Osama bin Laden to target Al-Qaeda, repeatedly pressed to say, well, is it an official aim to take out the Taliban, to topple the Taliban? The line has always been, well, if the people of Afghanistan feel they want to overturn their regime, we are behind them. It's a repressive regime. But in this address and in the sort of action that's taking place, it's clear that the American establishment, just like the British establishment, sees the Taliban and bin Laden's organization as so intertwined that you cannot strike at one without hitting the other.
Philippa, thank you. We've got a long night ahead of us. I'm sure we'll be back with you soon.
And just to bring you up to date again, the American offensive against the Taliban regime in Afghanistan has begun. There are reports of planes and four large explosions over the capital, followed by plumes of smoke. We're also having some reports in, unconfirmed at this point, but from several agencies saying that the attacks have destroyed the command base at the airport of Kandahar. That's the Taliban command base. This is a stronghold of the Taliban leader Mullah Mohammed Omar. Eyewitnesses also said that US bombs or rockets had struck near the Defense Ministry in Kabul. We can bring you more on that, of course, as it comes in. But joining me in the studio is the defense analyst, Paul Beaver. First of all, Paul, these attacks have started. We heard President Bush there saying that British and American military are taking part. Let's take a look at what they'll be using. First of all, what sort of military hardware do the Americans have?
Well, basically the Americans have anything you want and they in the area, or based it in the region. Basically, the British have got, the Americans have got the B-2 stealth bomber, capable of dropping satellite-guided bombs. They've got also the stealth fighter, the F-117, which is capable of also precision bombing as well. They've got the A-10 Warthog, this aircraft here, which is a very capable anti-tank aircraft. It carries missiles and guns. It's the sort of thing you would use to flush out individual tanks, which is one of the targets we think that the Americans will go for. The other thing that the Americans, of course, have got is the capability of using standoff weapons, cruise missiles, for example, and they have that capability of being able to launch those from some distance. The great thing that America has also is being able to use their aircraft at long distances, and this is pictures here of a tanker aircraft refueling one of the A-10 Warthogs. That extends the range of the aircraft almost just into the, if you like, the capability of the pilot to sit on the seat of the airplane. I mean, it can be kept in the air by refueling in flight. So America has a very flexible military response. So what it will probably want to do is use systems that don't risk too many pilots' lives or aircrew lives, because what they don't want to see are people being shot down.
What about the special forces? What role do they play, the undercover people?
Well, the special forces, the Americans have got about 5,000 of them. They have a different role from the SAS. They tend to use them in larger numbers. They have a lot of helicopters and aircraft which support them. They are capable of operating in terrain, the terrain of Afghanistan, for example, in bad weather conditions. They're capable of moving into a location, holding it for a number of hours, doing their business, and then pulling out again. So they have that capability. Now, the British, on the other hand, tend to operate in smaller groups and tend to be used for covert reconnaissance and intelligence gathering.
You mentioned the difficult terrain. I mean, does weather come into this? We keep hearing this has to be done before the winter, does it?
Well, the great thing about weather, of course, is it's a two-edged sword. I mean, it's just as bad for them as it is for us. And the Taliban aren't very sophisticated in the way they move around, and neither is Osama bin Laden's people. And so in winter, you get this very stark contrast between people and the surroundings, the hot and cold, which is very easy to detect, even from as far as space. So it is perfectly possible to operate in those conditions. And because we're not talking about a ground war, we're not talking about divisions of soldiers going in, I think it's going to be a lot easier to them to operate. More easier, in fact, than we'd expect.
Paul, I mean, this type of offensive, is it likely to be a sharp hit and then out again, and then another sharp hit and out again?
I get the impression that that's the sort of thing that they're doing. I mean, I think what we're going to see happening at first light tomorrow is there'll be drops of food and supplies. There'll be humanitarian drops that will be coordinated with the military in order to, if you like, it's a carrot and stick. It's demonstrating to the Taliban just how hard the Americans and the British can hit them. But then to the ordinary people of Afghanistan, they're going to be dropping food and supplies to show them that this is not a war against the people of Afghanistan. This is an attack on Taliban, not Afghanistan.
Paul Beaver, stay with us for the moment. Thank you. George.
Now we're going to join our correspondent Lyse Doucet, who's in the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Lyse, what's the reaction there?
Well, I think people are still glued now to their television screens and to their radios to follow these latest reports. They're still sketchy, of course. Confirmation that the war, if you like, has already begun. There have been attacks against Kabul as well as the southern stronghold of the Taliban, the city of Kandahar. We understand that electricity has now been cut in Kabul as well as in Kandahar, and that positions were hit close to the defense ministry in the Afghan capital, Kabul. A suggestion that perhaps what they're trying to take out are the air defenses of the Taliban regime so that they can go in with even more aircraft and possibly, of course, at a later stage for the food drops that the Pentagon has been talking about.
Lyse, while we're talking, we can now see these pictures, courtesy of Al Jazeera, an Arab television station, of these flashes in the night sky above Kabul. That is the beginning of America's assault on Afghanistan. I see I've got some wire reports here, Lyse. The Pakistan's military rulers have made their first clear move against pro-Taliban Islamic radicals. They've arrested someone. Can you talk about that?
Yes, earlier today they arrested the leader of the JUI party, Fazli Rahman. His party has the closest links to the Taliban. In fact, the Taliban sprung from the religious schools, the madrasas, which are run by this party. They adhere to the same strict interpretation of Islam. So the demonstrations across Pakistan that we've seen in recent weeks were largely led by this party. And I think the government grew increasingly concerned that as the news of an imminent strike got greater and greater, so did the rallies, and they simply couldn't take the risk that once there was an attack, and indeed this has now happened, that the processions would get even louder, noisier, and even more destabilizing for the government. So of course there is a risk that now that he's under house arrest, he could pose an even greater security risk. But the government has decided better to keep him under control rather than to let him loose.
And Lyse, we must stress that every time the Pakistani government makes a move like this, it's taking a risk, really, isn't it?
It's deeply, deeply sensitive here. In geographic terms, of course, Pakistan is on the front line. It's Afghanistan's neighbour. It shares a border. It shares a tribal area. It shares the same tribal affinities with many of the people of Afghanistan. And therefore, it's highly sensitive for it to be seen to be cooperating with the United States in attacks against a neighbouring country. It is true that the demonstrations have been largely attended by supporters or members of the hardline religious groups. But in homes right across Pakistan, anxious questions are being asked about who will suffer in these attacks against Afghanistan. What is the real nature of this mission? Is there really enough evidence against Osama bin Laden? And is there a secret agenda here? There's a lot of anti-American feeling in Pakistan. It runs very deep. Don't forget, Pakistan was also on the front line when America looked to Islamabad to fight Soviet-backed forces in Afghanistan during the Cold War. Pakistan felt it was let down after that, and it's waiting to see what will happen after it goes on the offensive again, fighting for America, fighting for an international coalition against a neighbouring Islamic state.
Right, Lyse Doucet, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
Now let me bring you up to date, first of all, with what's been happening. The military offensive against Osama bin Laden is underway. Loud explosions have been heard over the Afghanistan capital of Kabul. Speaking a few minutes ago, the US President George Bush said the action is carefully targeted against terrorist training camps and military installations. He also confirmed that British forces are involved in the attack. Residents in Kabul heard several separate explosions. Electricity supplies have been cut off in the city. It's also reported that Kandahar airport has been seriously damaged. Kandahar is the headquarters of the ruling Taliban movement. Now I'm going to take you live to Downing Street to show you the scene there of reporters assembling. Tony Blair is expected to make a statement from Downing Street shortly. In his address, President Bush said that Britain and America were working together and that British forces are involved in tonight's attacks. Now, let me just say again, the eastern Afghan city of Jalalabad is apparently also under attack. Tonight, one of the television channels have said they heard that the target appeared to be the airport near the city. The Northern Alliance Defence Minister, that's Dr. Abdullah, who had said earlier today that the attacks were imminent, said at least 3 training camps near Jalalabad may have been hit. These are unconfirmed reports at the moment. These attacks came just about 15 minutes after those attacks on the capital, Kabul. President Bush said that the operation will continue. It's not against the Afghan people. He's a friend of the Afghan people, but it will continue against those who are terrorists, and those who harbour terrorists. Well, our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, joins me now on the line from Afghanistan, north of Kabul, I believe. John, can you describe the scenes for us?
Well, we're not able to see Kabul from here. It's too far away, the mountains in between and so forth. But all the reports that you're getting are confirmed from this end. The attacks and so forth. Kabul, of course, is a city. I was there just recently. It's a city which is anyway largely without electricity during the evenings and night time. So, frankly, to take out the electricity is not going to change things a great deal for most or many of the inhabitants of the city. Nevertheless, I'm sure that the explosions are causing a great deal of fear among the inhabitants there, simply because they think it may be harbingers of something even worse.
John, President Bush said these attacks would be carefully targeted. What we're hearing, perhaps the airport, perhaps a couple of training camps have been hit. Is this what you would expect? Yes, that's first of all what one would expect. In particular, you were just talking about Jalalabad. I don't think there's any doubt that those training camps there, which are not very far from the airport, in fact quite close to it, would be particular targets, even though presumably they'll be empty and will have long been empty, but nevertheless they're symbolic and important symbolic targets. Secondly, though, I would frankly expect to hear quite soon
that there's some sort of attack on parts, at least, of the Taliban front line, not far from us here. I would have assumed that the Americans and perhaps the British would want to weigh in, as it were, on the side of the Northern Alliance and to damage the Taliban's military capacity. But we'll have to see that.
John, you know the Taliban very well and their movements very well. What would, in your opinion, would be their military capacity at this time? Will they be able to stand up to the might of America and the rest of the world?
Well, of course, it's difficult really to stand up against the kind of missiles and the kind of bombing that's clearly going to be the first phase of all of this. And you have to remember, these are not serious crack-trained troops, despite what some people seem to think about the Taliban. They really are quite a ragtag army. They're a collection of people, many of whom joined the Taliban simply because they thought they were going to win in the first place in 1996. And have stayed with them ever since, and who now clearly sense that the Taliban can't possibly win against the might of the United States. So therefore, I don't think we're looking at the kind of tried, battle-hardened troops who are going to stand fast under these circumstances. I wouldn't have expected them to put up very much of a show at all.
John, what about Osama bin Laden? The Taliban said they had hidden him under their control for his own safety. Will he now become too much of a liability?
Well, I suppose he has become so great a liability that their country is being fiercely attacked as a result of his presence there. So I don't think that it means that they will then say, OK, we'll hand him over. I may be wrong about that, but I wouldn't have thought so. They were offering earlier today to put him on trial in an Islamic court, presumably in this country, which of course would be totally unacceptable to the Americans. One possibility, I suppose, is that if the pressure on the Taliban became so great, and if it's true that they had him under their control, then they would do something, perhaps to hand him over in spite of all their instincts, especially the instinct of the leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, who has personally committed himself to protecting Osama bin Laden. But I think this is a very early stage at the moment in all of this, and I think it's difficult to know really whether the Americans are planning to put that kind of pressure on the Taliban really to destroy their entire infrastructure, or whether they're going to simply wait and see what happens and turn their attention to the military side.
John Simpson, live from north of Kabul in Afghanistan. Thank you very much indeed for the moment.
Now let's join Lyse Doucet, who's in Islamabad. Lyse, George Bush there talked about this being just another front in the war, along with intelligence and diplomacy. Both of those things, of course, Pakistan is a key player.
Indeed, Pakistan has played a very key role in the diplomacy because it is now the only government with any ties left to the Taliban. The question is, of course, whether it will now be forced, like the other two Islamic states who cut ties recently, to also sever ties with what had been their ally inside Afghanistan. It tried until the 11th hour and even longer to persuade the Taliban authorities to surrender Osama bin Laden, making it absolutely clear that it was the very survival of the Taliban which was at stake. But it was another reminder of, with Afghanistan, the Afghans will only cooperate with even their best of friends up to the point in which their own interests meet. And the Taliban very much felt that Osama bin Laden, who after all isn't simply an Islamic figure inside their country, he's a man who's fought with them, he's financed them, he's brought fighters to them, he's very, very much an integral part of the Taliban movement. So they weren't about to hand him over, and certainly not before they saw any evidence, and till this day they haven't seen any evidence.
All right, now that was Lyse Doucet. We're going to have to, I must apologise for those of you who are expecting Antiques Roadshow. We've interrupted our normal programming for a BBC News special on the events unfolding in Afghanistan. Now let's go back to Lyse Doucet. Lyse, we were talking earlier about what a difficult time this is for the Pakistani government.
Indeed, because Pakistan knows that as the frontline state in this war against terrorism, it will suffer the immediate aftershocks of any attacks. It will certainly deal with a humanitarian crisis. It will be the natural destination for many Afghans. The United Nations has painted a worst-case scenario of up to 1 million Afghans could try to flee into Pakistan. And remember that from the first time the Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan in 1979, more than 2 million Afghans came to Pakistan, and they still live here. So they are shouldering a very, very deep burden indeed, and it's highly, highly sensitive in political terms as well. But Pakistan will be watching these military developments with great, great interest. And with us here on this BBC News special to analyse these first moves by the American forces is the retired Lieutenant General Talat Massoud. Talat Massoud, we've had strikes now against the Afghan capital, against Kandahar. What do you think their first targets are?
I think they are trying to take on the anti-aircraft systems, so that their airspace is fairly secure. That is one, and they also want to paralyze their command structure, so they are also hitting at their command structure. So once they have paralyzed their command structure and also created a lot of confusion in their ranks, and also ensured that they have a very safe airspace, then they will have greater flexibility and maneuver.
And very much a reminder that Osama bin Laden is not the only target. They're going for the Taliban.
Of course, because they think that the Taliban have been supporting, and unless they remove the Taliban, and to remove the Taliban it is necessary that they create a situation wherein the Northern Alliance and other forces which are opposed to the Taliban then move forward to take over Kabul and important cities like Kandahar and Mazar-e-Sharif.
Now, the American Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld spoke of 23 high-value targets inside Afghanistan. After they've immobilized the air defenses, what would be their next target then?
Well, I think they will try to hit at all the strategic assets that they have, in the sense, whatever little they have, for instance, their tanks, their armored personnel carriers, even their ordinary vehicles, and their communications equipment, and also their command headquarters and anti-aircraft guns and mortars, and also they will hit at the concentration places where if there are any Talibans which are trying to concentrate in order to move towards Uzbekistan. So I think these would be the targets that I foresee.
And what do the Taliban have to fight back? What is the state of their heavy weaponry?
What they will do is they will disappear into the mountains. I don't think they will offer a lot of resistance in case they find that the situation has so developed that the Northern Alliance is moving forward. So I think they will move into the mountains and give over Kabul and other places. I think they are prepared for that.
But I think we did hear, though, reports of artillery fire coming from Kabul this evening, so at least they're putting up some symbolic resistance.
Yes, of course. Otherwise, the morale of the people would be very low, and they would say, well, what the hell, you are not looking after our interests, because there is a lot of civilian population there. And there is bound to be collateral damage, irrespective of how selective they would be. So I think one has to be very careful about that, although I'm sure that the United States would be very particular in ensuring that the least amount of collateral damage occurs.
But very, very dramatic contrast to the last strikes against Afghanistan by the Americans in 1998 after the bombings of the American embassies in East Africa. Then it was cruise missiles into the eastern part of Afghanistan against training bases. Very different strategy this time.
Well, at that time they were just aiming at the bases, the guerrilla bases and the training camps. This time it is much more wider, their attack. And they have much greater aims and wider aims, and it's a much more comprehensive attack. The build-up is much greater, and the results that they want to achieve are also far more greater than in the past. At that time it was very, very limited. This time the scope is very wide, and it means that they are also going to ensure that it is not only just the removal of the Taliban regime, but also subsequently they will also ensure that all the guerrilla bases there are, or the individuals or the groups which are operating as guerrillas, they are also flushed out. And for that they will have to continue with their operation for a long duration, for which they need certain troops. A
long war indeed. Lieutenant General retired Talat Massoud, thank you very much for joining us here. A sense of what may be behind the thinking of the Pentagon, and as General Massoud referred to euphemistically, the collateral damage. For the broad light of day tomorrow, we may say signs of that when Afghans start heading towards the Pakistan border. Back to you in London.
Lyse Doucet, thank you very much indeed. Now, I just want to bring you up to date with what's going to happen within the next few minutes. We're expecting a statement from the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, from Downing Street, following that address to the American people by President George Bush, telling them and the rest of the world that the offensive has begun against the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And that offensive is with British and American forces. So we're expecting, as I say, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, to make a statement in a few moments. Also, just let me tell you some news coming in. The countries in the alliance against terrorism beginning to show their support. Germany says it supports the attacks, quotes, without reservation. The German government said the US attacks terrorist targets in Afghanistan. That's from the Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. So Germany backing those attacks completely. Now we can join our correspondent Matt Frei, who joins me from Quetta near the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Matt, what's happening there?
Good evening. Well, Kandahar is about 250 kilometers behind me in Afghanistan. You wouldn't be able to see any glow from the lights there, from the explosions, because there are two mountain ranges in between and it is quite far. But that is the spiritual and political heartland of the Taliban. That's really the most important place in Afghanistan. That is the de facto capital, more important than the city of Kabul. Now, we've just spoken to one of our contacts there who was actually at the airport in Kandahar, and he reported 2 to 3 very big explosions. He maintained that the airport itself had not been hit, thus contradicting some of the other reports. He did also say that the lights of Kandahar had gone out, so clearly the power station there has been struck.
Now, Matt, of course, it would be a significant target anyway, even if they didn't take it out completely.
Of course, a very significant target. It's a very well defended airport. There are several radar-guided missile units there, which of course will be a threat to American and British planes flying over Afghanistan. There was a report earlier today that one reason for taking out these radar units was to try and enable planes to fly over Afghanistan at some stage in the next 24 hours to drop food aid into the country. Now, that's interesting because that really emphasizes yet again that this is not just a mission to strike against the terrorists and, of course, against the Taliban regime, but also a mission with a certain humanitarian bent. So we wait to see whether that's actually going to happen tomorrow. Again, we have no details about exactly which targets they were trying to get, but of course Kandahar is extremely significant. That's where Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, resides. That's where Osama bin Laden is thought to be hiding at the moment, and that's where many of his bases are thought to be, in that area.
Matt, has there been any political reaction from Pakistan, which of course has been a key player right up until this point in this fight against terrorism?
A key player, a frontline state. Pakistan helped to create the Taliban. Pakistan was one of the 3 countries that recognized the Taliban and still does diplomatically. Pakistan, of course, will have to deal with the backlash, all the fallout of any attacks that are taking place right now, not just because of refugees coming into Pakistan, but also because of very strong pro-Taliban feelings, especially in the city that I'm speaking to you from, Quetta. Now, there's been no reaction so far. That was your question, because it's fairly late in the evening here. No particular activity on the streets that we can notice here. But what was interesting is that earlier in the day, several leading figures of the JUI, a radical Islamic party, were put under house arrest, perhaps in preparation for the attacks, in preparation for some kind of reaction to them.
Matt Frei from Quetta on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Maxine. Now, we will go to Downing Street soon, where Tony Blair is due to make a statement from number 10. But before that, joining me now from Washington is our correspondent, Richard Lister. Richard, in a sense, this is what Americans have been waiting for ever since September the 11th. Any sign of reactions yet?
Not yet. Americans are glued to their television sets all across the country. They've heard what President Bush has had to say about this. Now they're waiting to hear the military side of it in a little more detail from the Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who's due to speak at the Pentagon fairly soon. But as you say, they have been braced for this for some time. President Bush said just about a week after the attacks that the American military should be ready. And I think in the kind of language that he's used, and used fairly quickly after the September 11th attacks, about this being a war on terrorism, the people of the United States have expected that there will be military action, and expected too that there may well be casualties, American casualties, amongst those who are killed in these attacks. So it is something that the Americans have been braced for. It's something that they've given President Bush their support for. They've said even if there are military casualties, this is a war worth pursuing. So I think this is a White House that can be confident of American support at this stage.
And yet, even as he launched these strikes, Richard, the President was talking about patience, talking about a sustained effort.
Indeed, and I think that's a point that the White House is very anxious to get across, that this is really just the start. This isn't the end of anything at all. This is the start of what could be a very long and eventually a very bloody campaign, taking in not just Afghanistan, but other countries, other governments, other terrorist groups. So this is something that the Bush administration has been very keen to stress, because I think the experience that Americans have had of combating terrorism in the past stems from the kind of action that President Clinton took in 1998 when he launched cruise missile strikes against an Al-Qaeda camp in Afghanistan and what was then thought to be a chemical weapons factory in Sudan, although that later proved to be somewhat erroneous. That was over and done really in a few hours, and I think what this president has been very keen to do is make sure that Americans understand that this time they've got to be in it for the long haul, that there may be retaliatory attacks by terrorists against the United States. They may have to face more attacks on home soil before this is over.
Richard, for the moment, thank you.
Now we can join our World Affairs editor John Simpson via video phone. John is north of the Afghan capital, Kabul. John, take us through what has been happening within the past hour or so.
Well, during the past hour, the attacks seem to have begun in Kabul itself, with attacks particularly on the electricity power supplies and presumably on telecommunications, although frankly neither electricity nor telecommunications are very much up to much in Kabul nowadays, but nevertheless presumably the whole thing's been cut out. Then there were attacks secondly in Kandahar in the south, and thirdly, which Kandahar being the main center really for the Taliban and the center for many of the government ministries there. And then finally, attacks in Jalalabad. We hear that they've been around the airstrip there, the airport, but it's also possible because some of the training camps which Osama bin Laden maintained were not far from there, that's really been the main source of it. Know nothing yet about casualties, whatever. But clearly these first strikes were meant to kind of set the tone, as it were, for what's coming next.
Not unexpected targets, and of course significant, because both Britain and America have said they want to hit at the heart of the Taliban.
Well, presumably the purpose is simply to destroy the Taliban as a government. Much as in the Gulf War, for instance, the coalition forces then tried to destroy Saddam Hussein's administration, his basic control over the country. That is a rather more difficult task, really, for Afghanistan, since the control is so slight and the system is so primitive, really. It's actually quite hard to strike it from the outside in the way that you might attack a more sophisticated country.
John, one of the purposes, of course, of the American and British attack was that they want Osama bin Laden handed over. And I'm just seeing some reports in front of me that the Taliban, following these strikes, are now saying they will not deliver him to the United States.
Well, it's not a great surprise, I suppose. I think they've just decided to dig in. It did seem faintly possible when they made, frankly, rather ludicrous offer earlier today to put Osama bin Laden on trial in an Islamic court, presumably in Afghanistan itself. But nevertheless, that you could, I suppose, have read that as maybe a first move towards surrendering him. But it doesn't. It's clear that they're not planning to do that now. Not absolutely certain that they've got control of him. I know they said they had the other day, but they say so many conflicting and different things that you can't believe it necessarily when they make a statement like that. I mean, it's perfectly possible that bin Laden has withdrawn to some fastness of his own, with his own guards protecting him.
John, just as we're talking here, the information is coming in about these strikes. I just want to tell the viewers that this is information from the Pentagon in Washington, that apparently Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched in this assault from American and British submarines. So they're really pulling out all the stops in this.
Well, yes, it sounds as though it is a kind of Gulf War or Belgrade 1999 experience. But as I say, it must be really difficult for the targeters to have worked out the right kind of places to hit, simply because Afghanistan in general, Kabul in particular, are not the kind of cities that they're used to hitting, that they've had this experience in the last 10 years of making strikes against. This is a really basic, a really primitive society with very, very little of the trappings of any kind of modern state at all.
John, you know the Taliban and their movements very well. In your opinion, what sort of an adversary are they? Not much of an adversary, to be honest. You've got to remember that whatever the size of their army, and you hear all sorts of conflicting stories about that, but really most of those are, as it were, allies of the Taliban, people that came across to them because simply back in 1996 they thought that the Taliban had the power, and they were right to think that, to capture the capital and to take over most of the country. Now, those are fair weather friends, and a lot of them will be now thinking, this is a battle that they can't possibly win. The Taliban must go down. Therefore, what's the purpose of standing and fighting with them? The Taliban themselves, it has to be said also, from the evidence of 1996, were a pretty feeble group of fighters. Their greatest strength came from these allies. So I don't think we need to think in terms, I mean, there's been all sorts of crazy reports, for instance, in the Pakistani press, for instance, about crack troops and battle-hardened troops and so on. That simply isn't what this is all about, and it won't be. And I don't think that they do represent any very serious opponents. I suppose, though, John, the threat could come from further terrorist strikes in the wake of this military assault. I mean, Washington, even just within the past few minutes, issuing another warning to American citizens that Americans and American interests abroad could now be at risk because of the assault.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one doesn't want to forecast on this kind of thing too much, but I mean, it is clear that the only effective arm of any of these people is terrorism, and that they have planned their terrorist attacks with great care, with great intelligence, presumably, and they have, of course, been highly successful. We've seen that. That is the strength of the thing. The Taliban themselves won't be involved in that at all. I mean, we're not talking here about some kind of international Taliban striking capability or anything remotely like that. I mean, they simply don't have it. But bin Laden's associates and supporters in the United States and in other countries as well do have that capability and must have been thinking about this situation that's now arisen.
John, we will return to you throughout the evening. That was our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, live from north of Kabul.
Now, I'm joined here in the studio by our diplomatic editor, Brian Hanrahan. Brian, Tony Blair took a very prominent role in the diplomacy. Now Britain's taken a very prominent role in these attacks.
Well, it's the only other, as far as we can see, the only other country apart from the United States to be involved in it. We were hearing there that it's the cruise missiles that have been used in the first strike, and I would imagine we will hear of British troops involved in any kind of follow-up operation. What we're still not clear about, and what is still difficult to discern, is quite what the point of all this is. But I think there are some clues in what George Bush was saying there. This appears to be the hors d'oeuvre, if you like. I mean, this is simply to disrupt communications, to prepare the way, to make sure there is no ability to attack America as it comes in from the air. But then he talked about sustained actions to drive out Osama bin Laden. Now that does imply that they intend to put people on the ground and go looking for him, and they want freedom to be able to move about and do that, which means they need their helicopters and need their planes to be able to fly without disruption. And also he talked about a patient accumulation of successes. This is a very long action. He was not saying we're going to go in there and find him. What he was saying is we're going to operate freely in Afghanistan, look for Osama bin Laden, and if necessary, drive him out or capture him there until he can't stay there anymore.
And through all this, Brian, the diplomacy goes on. I see that President Bush spoke to Vladimir Putin before the attacks actually took place.
Well, we know that President Bush has obviously spent most of the day telephoning people and telling them to expect. He told the Germans, he told the French, he told the Russians, and I suspect he will have told 20 or 30 other leaders the kind of people he wants to stay on his side in future, that attacks were imminent. Because one of the reasons why this is being launched now is because after this burst of diplomacy, partly Tony Blair, but also Donald Rumsfeld going around knocking the bits into place, making sure that America had a platform from which it could launch its attacks. They didn't want that to fall away. Having got everybody lined up and ready, it's important to move before something else came and knocked them off course. These diplomatic coalitions of what George Bush say 40 countries are very fragile. It's very easy for a single incident somewhere to start tearing away at it.
What kind of incident would affect this?
Bomb in the Middle East. An attack of some kind, an assassination. Any of these I mean, these are big incidents, but nonetheless, they're the kinds of things which you have to be prepared to see happening at moments like this, and they can disrupt the kind of actions that are going on, even some kind of switch in political allegiance inside Russia. If there was a sort of big parliamentary revolt, President Putin felt he had to pull back a bit and not be so helpful to America. I mean, these are the kinds of things that can seriously affect what people are able to do. So once having got everything in place, it was really important to use it while it was there, because the longer you try and hold this in place, the more you have to keep tinkering with it, the more the chances of it going adrift get greater.
Brian, we can have a look at these pictures, these latest pictures we've got of explosions above Kabul. Now, part of the problem with starting this kind of attack is that you've got to begin to start showing some results. How long do you think President Bush has?
Very hard to tell. We know that in America the opinion polls are starting to move away from saying it's okay to wait, you know, you're a great statesman, it's a good thing. They're starting to say we want to see some results. So I think another reason for moving on is that the public backing for George Bush depends to some, you know, the willingness to wait was beginning to fray. So once he'd got everything ready, then waiting just a bit longer was not a very good option. So you start moving. The difficulty is, I mean, Afghanistan really doesn't, John Simpson was saying, it really doesn't have targets. I mean, they have 2 power stations and 200 miles of paved road, and they have anti-aircraft weapons. So what you're trying to hit is very hard to get at. You might try and take out some of the Taliban leadership, but that's very hard because finding them is always a difficult thing to do. And so the number of targets you can actually say you want to get at are very, very low indeed. I suspect that most of the reports we've had, there were reports from around Kandahar of around 30 loud explosions and flashes in the night, which are seen by people on the border with Pakistan. And that seemed to be near the airport. Most of the reports we've had of any kind of bangs and flashes, and that's really all we're working on at the moment, seem to be near what were military installations. It's difficult to describe them as that in Afghanistan, but people who have, where there might be some kind of anti-aircraft capability, which obviously the Americans don't want to survive.
Well, if there are so few targets, infrastructural targets, if you like, as you suggest, then there is going to have to be a second stage, and a second stage rather quickly.
I think George Bush made that very clear, that this is really just a starter. It's to clear out of the way anything that might block America's freedom of access to Afghanistan. And then they have 2 objectives. One is to move in freely and do what they like. Now that'll be tricky because attacking Afghanistan is always a delicate process. It can make people turn against you as easily as decide to join up with you. And the other is to get food in. Now I think we will see America flying in food aid as fast as it thinks it can do so, as it's safe to do so. And part of the reason why they need freedom of access is so they can go in and they can say to the people, look, we're here to help you. Because there was some flirting last week with the idea that if they waited a bit, the Taliban might collapse. I think people were attracted to that idea that why fight a war if you can get what you want by propaganda? And then I think they decided that really wasn't worth trying to do, and waiting wasn't going to, you couldn't rely on it being a success quickly enough, and so they've decided to go in, and this time they're pushing the Taliban very hard. If they aren't going to fall over themselves, they're going to be helped help to fall over by this outside attack. So I think part of the strategy is still to sideline the Taliban, remove them out of the way, allow opposition to them, if they can't fly their helicopters, if they can't use their heavy weapons, then it allows people who don't like the Taliban to rise up against them and move up. And the Americans, I think, would be very keen on seeing that happen and striking a deal with some kind of new government, A, to help them with their people, but more importantly, to kick out Osama bin Laden if they can find him. I think part of this is that you can't be sure of catching Osama bin Laden, you can't be sure of killing him, but you can reckon if you can keep him moving, if you can take away the one safe haven in the world that's good for him, then you can get him out of Afghanistan, you can get him into some other country. No matter how secure he might feel, he is then at risk.
Brian, thank you very much. And let's go to Downing Street now for Tony Blair, a statement from the Prime Minister.
As you will know from the announcement by President Bush, military action against targets inside Afghanistan has begun. I can confirm that UK forces are engaged in this action. I want to pay tribute, if I might, right at the outset, to Britain's armed forces. There is no greater strength for a British Prime Minister and the British nation at a time like this than to know that the forces we are calling upon are amongst the very best in the world. They and their families are, of course, carrying an immense burden at this moment and will be feeling deep anxiety, as will the British people. But we can take pride in their courage, their sense of duty, and the esteem with which they're held throughout the world. No country lightly commits forces to military action and the inevitable risks involved. But we made it clear, following the attacks upon the United States on September the 11th, that we would take part in action once it was clear who was responsible. There is no doubt in my mind, nor in the mind of anyone who has been through all the available evidence, including intelligence material, that these attacks were carried out by the Al-Qaeda network masterminded by Osama bin Laden. Equally, it is clear that his network is harbored and supported by the Taliban regime inside Afghanistan. It is now almost a month since the atrocity occurred. It is more than 2 weeks since an ultimatum was delivered to the Taliban to yield up the terrorists or face the consequences. It is clear beyond doubt that they will not do this. They were given the choice of siding with justice or siding with terror, and they chose to side with terror. There are three parts, all equally important to the operation in which we're engaged: military, diplomatic, and humanitarian. The military action we are taking will be targeted against places we know to be involved in the Al-Qaeda network of terror or against the military apparatus of the Taliban. This military plan has been put together mindful of our determination to do all we humanly can to avoid civilian casualties. I cannot disclose, obviously, how long this action will last, but we will act with reason and resolve. We have set the objectives to eradicate Osama bin Laden's network of terror and to take action against the Taliban regime that is sponsoring him. As to the precise British involvement, I can confirm that last Wednesday, the United States government made a specific request that a number of UK military assets be used in the operation which has now begun, and I gave authority for these assets to be deployed. They include the base at Diego Garcia, reconnaissance and other aircraft, and missile-firing submarines. The missile-firing submarines are in use tonight. The air assets will be available for use in the coming days. The United States are obviously providing the bulk of the force required and leading this operation. But this is an international effort. As well as the UK, France, Germany, Australia, and Canada have also committed themselves to take part in it. On the diplomatic and political front, in the time I've been Prime Minister, I cannot recall a situation that has commanded so quickly such a powerful coalition of support, and not just from those countries directly involved in military action, but from many others in all parts of the world. That coalition has, I believe, strengthened, not weakened, in the 26 days since the atrocity occurred. And this is in no small measure due to the statesmanship of President Bush, to whom I pay tribute tonight. The world understands that whilst, of course, there are dangers in acting, the dangers of inaction are far, far greater. The threat of further such outrages, the threat to our economies, the threat to the stability of the world. On the humanitarian front, we are assembling a coalition of support for refugees in and outside Afghanistan, which is as vital as the military coalition. Even before September the 11th, 4 million Afghans were on the move. There are 2 million refugees in Pakistan and 1.5 million in Iran. We have to act for humanitarian reasons to alleviate the appalling suffering of the Afghan people and to deliver stability so that people from that stay in that region. Britain, of course, is heavily involved in that humanitarian effort. So we are taking action, therefore, on all those three fronts: military, diplomatic, and humanitarian. I also want to say very directly to the British people why this matters so much directly to Britain. First, let us not forget that the attacks of September the 11th represented the worst terrorist outrage against British citizens in our history. The murder of British citizens, whether it happens overseas or not, is an attack upon Britain. But even if no British citizen had died, it would be right to act. This atrocity was an attack on us all, on people of all faiths and people of none. We know the Al-Qaeda network threatened Europe, including Britain, and indeed any nation throughout the world that does not share their fanatical views. So we have a direct interest in acting in our own self-defense to protect British lives. It was also an attack not just on lives, but on livelihoods. We can see since the 11th of September how economic confidence has suffered, with all that means for British jobs and British industry. Our prosperity and standard of living, therefore, require us to deal with this terrorist threat. We act also because the Al-Qaeda network and the Taliban regime are funded in large part on the drugs trade. 90% of all the heroin sold on British streets originates from Afghanistan. Stopping that trade is again directly in our interests. I wish to say finally, as I've said many times before, that this is not a war with Islam. It angers me, as it angers the vast majority of Muslims, to hear bin Laden and his associates described as Islamic terrorists. They are terrorists, pure and simple. Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion, and the acts of these people are wholly contrary to the teachings of the Quran. These are difficult and testing times, therefore, for all of us. People are bound to be concerned about what the terrorists may seek to do in response. I should say there is at present no specific credible threat to the UK that we know of, and that we have in place tried and tested contingency plans which are the best possible response to any further attempts at terror. This, of course, is a moment of the utmost gravity for the world. None of the leaders involved in this action want war. None of our nations want it. We are a peaceful people. But we know that sometimes, to safeguard peace, we have to fight. Britain has learnt that lesson many times before in our history. We only do it if the cause is just, but this cause is just. The murder of almost 7,000 innocent people in America was an attack on our freedom, our way of life, an attack on civilized values the world over. We waited so that those responsible could be yielded up by those shielding them. That offer was refused. We have now no choice. So we will act, and our determination in acting is total. We will not let up or rest until our objectives are met in full. Thank you.
The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, addressing the nation just following a similar address by the President of the United States, George Bush. He confirmed that UK forces have been engaged in the military offensive tonight in Afghanistan. He said, "We will do all we can, all we humanly can, to avoid civilian casualties." He said he cannot disclose how long the offensive will take, but he said there is no doubt in his mind the attacks were carried out by Osama bin Laden and his network.
The military offensive against Osama bin Laden is underway. Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched against Afghanistan by US and British submarines who are known to have attacked 3 primary areas. Loud explosions were heard in the Afghan capital of Kabul, where electricity supplies were cut off. The airport in the southern city of Kandahar is reported to have been destroyed. Kandahar is the headquarters of the ruling Taliban movement. The eastern Afghan city of Jalalabad is also reported to be under assault from the air. Both the US President George Bush and Tony Blair have stressed that the action was carefully targeted against terrorist training camps and military installations.
In the darkness above Kabul, anti-aircraft fire lights up the night sky. Confirmation that the American-led war on terrorism had begun. Within minutes, White House spokesman Ari Fleischer was announcing that the offensive was underway, followed by an address to the American nation by President Bush.
We are beginning another front in our war against terrorism, so freedom can prevail over fear. The President will address the nation at 12:50. Thank you.
More than 2 weeks ago, I gave Taliban leaders a series of clear and specific demands. Close terrorist training camps, hand over leaders of the Al-Qaeda network, and return all foreign nationals, including American citizens unjustly detained in your country. None of these demands were met. And now, the Taliban will pay a price. By destroying camps and disrupting communications, we will make it more difficult for the terror network to train new recruits and coordinate their evil plans.
Talks that military strikes were imminent had been circulating since early this afternoon. In Kabul, scores of people had been leaving overnight after Taliban anti-aircraft guns were heard trying to hit what they believed to be an American spy plane circling overhead. British troops are also involved in the action, with confirmation that cruise missiles have been launched from both American and British ships. Louise Bevan, BBC News.
I'm joined now by diplomatic editor Brian Hanrahan. Brian, very clear there about the aims: eradicate Osama network and action of the Taliban regime that supports it.
And if necessary, removing them. And what is also clear is that this is going to go on for some considerable time. Tony Blair talked about we would see air assets used in the coming days. In other words, this hasn't been done, and we also don't know whether or not British troops will be involved in any ground forces, which it's fairly clear that George Bush is talking about there being some kind of ground involvement. No specific credible threat to the UK that we know of, so no danger of terrorist attack.
Thank you, Brian. And you've been watching a BBC News special.
There'll be continuing coverage, of course, throughout the evening on BBC and BBC News 24.